Welcome back. Tomorrow is Labor Day, and we thought we'd take a look at labor in Connecticut and some of the important milestones in the labor movement in our state. Joining us to dig into that is Professor Cecelia Bucki from Fairfield University. Thank you so much for being with us. This is a big weekend if you're a labor historian. So tell us, how did Labor Day get started, Professor Bucki?
It's so hard to go over 150 years of labor history. Well, actually, Labor Day is the official holiday as it was set up by the federal government in the 1890s, but really backs up to the famous 1886 fight for the 8-hour day that was promulgated by the very first act of the American Federation of Labor. It was not successful, but it did provide what was basically a nationwide scale of strikes. Interestingly, the work week is still an issue. Now, back then, the 8-hour day meant a 48-hour week because Saturday was a full working day. How we go to that combination of the overturning the agenda from deindustrialization of the 1980s is one effect of the pandemic, and so is a new attention to essential workers and the ways in which the family, and particularly women, acting as workers as well as home makers and childcare workers, is creating interesting clashes.
Well, certainly there's a lot of
socially.
Certainly there's a lot of modern day stuff, and I want to talk about that. But looking back in history, I know New York City and labor unions and labor activists. We of course know about May Day, which is an important day on the labor and labor union calendar as well. So what was the message that was being sent, especially when the federal government did eventually recognize this as a holiday? Was it that labor had accomplished some big gains for the worker?
Well, that's one way of looking at it. The other way is to try to bring the new labor movement into the political fold. May Day, 1886, was the first mass wave of strikes for the 8-hour day. That actually was a very radical movement. It was promulgated not just by American Federation of Labor or craft unions, but also by socialists and anarchists in various cities, from New York to Chicago. And so it was a more sanitized version of celebrating Labor Day that had to do with the major conflicts of the 1890s, which was a very tumultuous decade, ending with a series of economic depressions. And so the analysis is that politicians and labor leaders as well wanted to create a new style acceptance of labor within the fold of the American political system. And so Labor Day weekend became the first weekend in September that did not have radical connotations. And for much of the 20th century, it really was a day for labor to get together. There were parades, which don't really exist anymore. There was a big picnic, barbecues, etc., some of which would still exist. And within the last 50 years, it's been basically just a big 3-day weekend to take care of your family and go somewhere.
Well, and everybody likes a 3-day weekend. But let me ask you about some of these modern changes. And one of them, you talked about how it was the 8-hour day, but it was 6 of them. So now we're at 5 of them as probably the standard. But you're actually starting to see in your research 4 becoming the new norm. Sounds good to me. Is that something we should all look forward to?
Well, I mean, these are raised by the pandemic. So there's a lot of talk of like people just absenting themselves for a day, or basically either working from home or whatever. So a lot of things have changed, especially in non-industrial work. So office work and service work, where you can actually have a little more flexibility in your workday. And managers are trying to grapple with that. But workers are basically saying, well, acting on their own, but also starting to become issues within formal labor movements. What the big strike waves these days are, like the UPS threat of a strike, was actually about undoing the two-tier labor wage systems and a lack of certain benefits that is a result of the deindustrialization of the 1980s. So it's trying to undo a couple decades of worsening labor relations and weakening of the labor movement. I don't know. I can't predict the future. Historians don't predict the future. They basically say this is what's happened in the past. And the strength of labor and people, working people in general, either deciding individually or collectively to say this is how we want to work, is an important thing that this whole new heightened awareness of essential workers over the last couple of pandemic years. I'm not quite sure what's going to happen.
Well, certainly,
but it's certainly a very intriguing possibility.
Well, and this is the weekend to talk about it, this halfway through the Labor Day weekend. And I bet those file cabinets behind you are full of more interesting stuff you could tell us. But Professor Cecelia Bucki, we're all out of time. Thank you for joining us to talk about Labor Day weekend.
Okay,
we'll be back with the new leader of the Yukon Marching Band coming up right after this. Stay with us.